Good morning, colleagues. Good morning. Welcome to this public webinar. On the MTBPS. I hope you had a good night's rest. You're ready for our wonderful discussions today. Shall we give it maybe just 2 more minutes and then we start? We've got a packed program lined up today. You're very exciting. So let's start, let's wait maybe 1-2 more minutes and then I'll kick off, I'll kick us off. I'll introduce myself as well. So let's just be a little bit more patient and we'll get the proceedings underway. Thank you. Thank you so much for your patience. Good morning back again, colleagues. I think we should start. We are seeing a steady flow of people coming into the program. I'm Russell Wilderman. I'm with UNICEF South Africa. I'll be moderating the first session, which essentially deals with welcoming you, setting the tone for the discussions for today. And as I said, we've got a packed program. So what I'd like to do is to introduce our 2 opening speakers. I'll read from their bios and then I will invite each of them to kick us off. So let me start with Christine Muhigana. So Christine Muhigana took up her duties as UNICEF representative in the Republic of South Africa on 3rd of September 2020. Prior to appointment to this position, she was the UNICEF representative in the Central African Republic from April 1, 2017 to July 2020. During a time in the Central African Republic, she led the organization's team in increasing the immunization coverage, school enrollment, protection of children and treatment of severe malnutrition through building systems and responding to humanitarian shocks. And prior to appointment to that position, between October 2013 and April 2017, she was UNICEF's Deputy Regional Director for the Western Central African region, based in Dakar, Senegal. In this capacity, she provided leadership and strategic guidance to the country offices in the region in the development and implementation of UNICEF country programs. Between May 2008 and October 2013, she also served as Deputy Secretary on the executive board of UNICEF based in New York, United States of America. She provided coordination and guidance to the board, ensuring decisions were strategic and contributed to advancing the overall child rights agenda. During the same period from July to August 2013, she served as acting UNICEF representative in Cameroon, where she played a leading role in the development, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation of the country program, including in the response to the food crisis in the North and Far North regions. And then finally, from February 2007 to May 2008, she was a strategic planning specialist in the United Nations Peacebuilding Support Office based in New York, USA. In this particular role, she served as the permanent coordinator for Burundi, including by assisting the Burundi configuration of the Peacebuilding Commission in developing and implementing an integrated peacebuilding strategy. Ms. Muhigana holds a master's degree in political science and international relations, as well as a master's degrees in maritime and air law from the University Libre Bruxelles in Belgium. She's a Rwanda national and is married to Dr. Eric Mercier. Welcome, Christine. Let me first also do the introduction for Isobel. Ms. Isobel Frye is the founding director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute in Johannesburg. She worked as a director at a commercial law practice before moving to work as the Black Sash National Advocacy Manager. From there, she moved to work as a senior researcher at Naledi, the research service organization of the Trade Union Federation COSATU, before starting SPII. SPII undertakes, and I can attest to this, excellent both primary and secondary research into poverty and social exclusions, and policy analysis in the field of anti-poverty policies, inequality, socioeconomic, and constitutional rights and social protection. Isobel serves on the Academy of Science of South Africa Standing Committee on Science for the Reduction of Poverty and Inequality. She has served on the board of boards of a variety of national and regional bodies. She serves on the Global Strategic Advisory Body for a leading ecumenical, development agency, and she's a former member of the UIF board and is current representative of community constituency at NEDLAC. She's an active contributor to print and broadcast media on policy issues on poverty, inequality, and socioeconomic rights. She's a co-producer of a podcast series called Rewired with acclaimed financial journalist Duma Kobile, focusing on topical social, economic, and COVID build-back policies. She's a well-respected advocate for universal basic income grant, a position that she's actively campaigned for since 2012. She also received the prestigious honor of being appointed as one of the first national minimum wage commissioners by the Minister of Labor in January 2019. And as you will have seen from the two bios, we've got two formidable and impressive women leading us. And I'm going to invite Christine to kick us off. Thank you so much. Christine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Russell. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Perfectly well. Thank you.
So good morning to all who are participating in this exciting and very important conversation this morning. My co-host, Ms. Isobel Frye, Executive Director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, members of various South African government delegations, the National Treasury team that will lead the government of the Republic of South Africa's input, representatives from Parliament, members of the diplomatic and international development community here in South Africa, members of civil society and academic institutions, our regional social policy colleagues who are connected, and all UNICEF colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. It is a great privilege indeed for me to be here with you this morning. A warm welcome to this public webinar that examines the recently released medium-term budget policy statement for 2021 and how decisions contained in the policy statement affect the realization of adults and children's socioeconomic rights. There is a full appreciation of the complexity that underlie public finance and public policy. And as a partner of the South African government, we are fully aware of the need to take hard decisions. An event such as ours today does not make decision-making any easier, but it could at least serve as a platform for ongoing dialogue among social partners in moving the country and, may I dare say, the world forward. The participation of National Treasury is further evidence of this government's commitment to social cohesion and its vision of galvanizing the full breadth and spectrum of intellectual and policy talent in South Africa. This is what makes South Africa such a unique country in its steadfast
Christine, if you can hear me. Hi, Christine. It looks like we've got a connection issue with Christine. We'll try to get Christine back ASAP. There's a power cut in Brooklyn, Pretoria. And I think let's just give it 20 seconds. If not, I'm going to shoot to Isobel just to keep up the momentum in terms of time. Isobel, I may call upon you in 30 seconds. I see that you're ready. My wish is for Christine to come back. Let's just give it 20 seconds. I'm trying also to communicate with Christine at the same time. This is the dangers of power cuts and its a deleterious impact on our ability to do our work. In fact, this is part and parcel of why we're here today, and it's wonderful that we have the National Treasury also represented here today. Isobel, I think what you should do maybe is to give your opening words, and then I will allow Christine, once she's back on stream, to actually continue. Over to you, Isobel. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And poor Christine, I do sympathize. It's incredibly frustrating when you're caught in this dilemma of being lost somewhere. So I will, and I want to thank you, Russell, for those very kind words of introduction. As the Executive Director of SPII, it gives me great pleasure to open, together with UNICEF, this webinar today. SPII has started working increasingly closely with UNICEF over the last 2 years, both on our decent standard of living research and also on promoting budget training and budget advocacy. So we are grateful to them. I'd also like to thank, beyond UNICEF, our partners, Budget Justice Coalition. Daniel will be speaking to us from Ireland today, so that shows that we have global reach. So it should be the Global Budget Justice Coalition, the South African Human Rights Commission, Rural Health Advocacy Project, and also welcome National Treasury and everybody else who is joining us today. Before I proceed, I would like to note special thanks to the SPII team, particularly Lindy K. Kumalo, together with the other members of her team, and thank you for taking away the stresses of being in charge, so to speak, through your excellency. I would like to commence with just reading a short poem as part of my opening words. I found this in a publication from South Africa, which was written in 1988. I received it when I was in Standard 9, and it was something which struck me with a vision and hope for the future. So it is not very long. And the poem is by Nise Malangi, written May Day 1985, and it's called I, the Unemployed. I'm here, living under a black cloud, here living in thinning light. Here, freedom is nailed to a tree to die. Here I am living in a matchbox. I am here dying of hunger, and my country is also dying. My children are dying too. Look at them. How dull their eyes, how slow their walk and the turning of their heads. Nothing for them to eat. Can you hear? They are crying. I spit at the sun shining on me, blazing every day. I am waiting for the rain to come, and I cannot plow this beautiful piece of earth. Here I am, unemployed. I, the unemployed, I am here but invisible. Preacher man, pray for the rain to come. White collars in your chrome and brown armchairs, please brighten up this thinning light. I am appealing to you, oppressors, to free freedom from the tree. My face buried with anger and sorrow, my stomach filled with hatred and pain. I behave like a lunatic. My children are dying, my kids are dying, malnutrition, kwashiorkor. There is nothing growing here, and the animals have died. All I hear now is the wind at night. It whirls around, spelling the agony of a death. I'm dying. Now, I think many years later, so much has changed, and our presentations will look to that. But there's certain things that continue to challenge our democracy. At SPII, our research demonstrates that jobs are just not possible to meet the collective needs. And this raises the critical question, how can the budget be used as a tool for collective redistribution and correction? We know that all states spend the monies that they raise. The question is what they spend on and how they define that spend. So we really look forward to an engagement today on the MTBPS, which was handed down last week, and which will forecast the expenditure patterns from next February for the MTEF. We welcome wholesome and critical debate and discussion. We would also just like to say that we listen and we differ to each other with respect and humility in order to make sure that we can collectively proceed to meet the constitutional rights and obligations in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Isobel, thank you for those moving poetic words. Just a reminder that this discussion is obviously set within the context of poverty and inequality and the countries grappling with this formidable social challenge. All the contributions today are intended to understand how we can respond, both as government, as civil society, as members of the international development community, to this difficult challenge that has been with South Africa for a while. I'm double checking. Christine, are you back? Are you able to complete your opening words? We are suffering severe power cuts in the east of Pretoria, and we've got backup systems, but sometimes even the backup systems need to be backed up. I will give Christine, I think, about 20 seconds. If that is not going to work, then I'm going to just cut to the next session. So bear with us. Unfortunately, this is the reality of where we are now. Maybe just a few more seconds, and then we'll go to the next segment of the program. Let me just also check my WhatsApp. Okay, so there are some clear problems on Christine's side. So let's basically cut to the next presentation. It gives me great privilege to introduce our National Treasury team. Sincere gratitude from our side, both us and SPII, for making the time. It was actually Isobel who suggested that we should not have an MTBPS event close to the actual delivery of the MTBPS, because most senior officials are caught up in delivering and executing on their obligations, and therefore we decided to have this particular event a week later. So National Treasury will be joined by two colleagues, Dr. Mark Blecher and Mr. Vincent Mahupa. So I'll start introducing Dr. Blecher first. Dr. Blecher is a Chief Director, Health and Social Development in National Treasury of South Africa. His academic qualifications include a 4-year specialist degree in community public health at University of Cape Town and a PhD in an area of health economics. He has over 50 publications in the field of public health and health economics in a range of books and journals, including the South African Medical Journal, South Africa Health Review, Vaccine, OECD book, and others. He supervises a team of 10 in the National Treasury and has previously worked in policy and planning in health economics in the public sector. His work encompasses many areas, including national health insurance research and development, putting in place health conditional grants like the HIV/AIDS grant, heading health and social protection function committees, which make recommendations on sectoral budget allocations. His section of the Treasury also works on social grant modeling and budgeting, ECD, and other aspects of health and social development. He has also worked on aspects of social security development. Dr. Blecher was co-chair of UNAIDS Economic Reference Group and works regularly with various global organizations such as WHO, Gavi, Global Fund, GWF, and others. He is currently co-authoring several international cross-country studies on universal health care. Welcome, Dr. Blecher. Mr. Vusi Mahupa Vusi is a senior policy analyst at National Treasury. He's been with the National Treasury for 9 years. He holds a Master's of Arts in Development Studies degree from the University of Sussex, United Kingdom, and a Master's of Administration in Municipal Administration degree from the University of Pretoria, just down the road, with a research focus on the government admin capacity to address South Africa's socio-economic challenges. I see, Christine, you are back. I think what we should do, I have already introduced the National Treasury team, but please go ahead and finish up, I think, your opening remarks. And then after you, I will ask the National Treasury team to join. Please, Christine, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Russell, and apologies for this technical glitch. Can you hear me?
Perfectly clear. Thank you, Christine.
Yes, so I was actually saying that South Africa is the most open and transparent country in the world regarding the quality and comprehensiveness of its national and provincial budgets. We are honored as UNICEF to co-host this event with the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, with whom we have worked together on multidimensional poverty and applied budget analysis work. Long may this partnership continue, and we look forward to active and constructive engagements with the core issues as laid out in the published MTBPS. For us at UNICEF, and as a member of the United Nations system, an event such as this is not a luxury, but a necessity and a privilege to witness a society-wide conversation about the realization of socio-economic rights for children and adults, and how budget policy could support this constitutional pathway. I wish us all fruitful and constructive and exciting deliberations. Thank you, Russell, and apologies for the technical glitch.
Perfectly understood. Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you for your wise words setting us off. I will now call upon Dr. Blecher and Mr. Maupa to start your presentation. Mark and Vusi, do you need to share your screen? Lindy, will you be able to assist?
Hi, Russell. We'll share from our side. Thank you so much.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Dr. Mark, I'll hand over to you. I'm not sure if you want to do introductory comments before we proceed, or should I go ahead? Okay, perhaps I could do that. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us. My name is Mark Blecher. We really appreciate being here. We're very glad to talk to you. We think it's very important that National Treasury is talking to civil society, and we know that often civil society differs with the views of the Treasury on different issues. Sometimes we have similar views, sometimes we have different views. So that healthy debate is very important, and I think that we are committed to trying to hear all voices in trying to make final policy decisions. The medium-term budget policy statement is in the middle of the year, so it's still 6 months before the main budget. So things still do have quite a lot of room to change. So thank you very much for, and I'll hand over to Vusi, who will talk through some of the economic and fiscal parts of the MTBPS, and then I'll come on to some of the spending issues. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mark, and good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen. So honored to have been invited to this session. We've been looking forward to the session since day one when we received the invitation to come and form part of this presentation. We want to, with this presentation, really, among other things, cover 3 key things. One, we want to outline the macroeconomic conditions that underpinned the presentation of the MTBPS, as we all received it last week on Thursday.
And two, we want to highlight the fiscal outlook as presented in the MTBPS. And lastly, we would go into some details in the numbers by sphere of government as well as by different sectors. And that's where Dr. Mark will be looking at some of the key numbers that are contained in the budget and how this sector is affected in the civil society at large. So just to kick off, we want to indicate that we all knew going to the budget that we were under very strict conditions that were brought by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we went into the MTBPS on the 11th after having jostled with a lot of thinking around how do we budget and how do we proceed with a budget under such trying conditions. And over the next 3 years, we want to balance the support that will ensure that there is economic recovery in the country, as well as there is reconstruction through short-term spending that addresses the impact of COVID-19 and some other negative occurrences that we've seen over the past couple of months, as well as looking to some structural reforms that we've been speaking about for some time. The good news, though, is that the economy recovered quicker than anticipated. You would see in the next few slides that we'll present. And, but this is on the back of the spike we've seen in the commodity prices, which supported our GDP growth, and the revenues have been far larger than we have expected, some dubbing it a tax windfall. So we think also that fiscal consolidation is quite critical to reduce the public debt burden. That will also help us to restore the investor confidence and really help us to avoid the overexposure that we'll have on the global and domestic risks. So, and I think there's a term that we've seen being used coming towards this light at the end of the consolidation tunnel. That's what we also spoke about. So this really suggests that somewhat we are moving from an improved fiscal trajectory compared to what we presented earlier this year in Feb in the 2021 budget. And we project to receive a primary surplus by the final year of the current MTF, which is year 24-25. Our strategy as government is to really propose or to maintain restraint in the public expenditure. So we're not getting excited by the windfalls we see, but really maintain restraint that we have been maintaining over years, and will not commit to long-term spending, will not make any long-term spending commitments in response to what we are seeing in the revenue numbers. As a result, we are not providing any additional funding to our state-owned companies over the medium term, excuse me. From the global front, the economy has, in most, if not all the economies, have rebounded quite strongly. You'd realize that in 2020, we were, most countries, including ourselves, were hit by the pandemic and we contracted. And this year, there is projections by the World Bank as well as our own estimates. We are projecting to rebound. This has a base effect that build into this, but from our side is, if you look at, we are projecting to grow by 5.1 this year. That's pretty much average of both the advanced economies and the emerging countries, almost around the ballpark average of the two. And over the next 2 years, we moderate to 1.8 and then 1.6 in growth. That's what we are somehow seeing over the next couple of years. But this is largely dependent on various factors, including the global vaccination access, the rate at which the vaccine will be accelerated, as well as the support that the monetary and fiscal policy will provide to us, including the stabilization of the inflation. And on the domestic outlook, we are projecting that the real GDP will grow, as you saw, by 5.1 this year, and then going down to 1.7 in 24-25. And the household consumption is also rebounding, but not as strongly, and over the next 3 years, it sort of moderates to about 1.5. So this indicates really of where we're standing as government in as far as economic growth domestically is concerned. We, take into account when we project our revenue and spending, and we, don't want to bake too much into it going to the future, because you see the curve is sort of going down over the next years. So the in-year is driven by a couple of factors, as I indicated earlier on, including the commodity boom that we've seen over the past couple of months. On the fiscal strategy, we've heard the minister presenting last week, and the message that we are championing is that we still remain committed to reducing our budget deficit and stabilizing that as a ratio of GDP over the long term. And we also want to use part of the high taxes that we are seeing currently being generated from the revenue services associated with the commodity prices to narrow our deficit and provide a short-term relief to some of the most hard-hit sectors of our economy. And in line with the government commitment to support the households, particularly given the still ongoing COVID-19, we are making additional resources for the social protection, or will be considered to be made for the social protection if the fiscal situation improves by 2022. Dr. Mark will speak shortly or briefly on this. Over the next 3 years, we want to ensure that spending will remain restrained. We're not going to go out because we see the windfalls. That is to avoid the widening of the budget deficit. But whilst we do that, we are taking we have taken a conscious decision to ensure concerted efforts to spend in infrastructure projects that will be financed through our facility called Infrastructure Fund, which uses a combination of a private-public partnership and other funding arrangements to really improve the planning and speed up the service delivery, or the speed up the delivery of infrastructure project. Because in our view, or perhaps in the view of the economy, you'd understand that infrastructure is quite key to the economic growth. So our own consolidation or a way forward is to channel more spending towards the infrastructure sector, ensure that there is that growth that is much more needed. Here, what we're presenting is what we call the main budget primary balances. The primary balance is the gap between what government generates as revenue and what government spends, excluding interests. So you would see that in last year, 2020-21, there was this huge gap that was created. So the budget balance really expanded there, and we are focusing to narrow it down as we go. And this, I think, the widening was due to the COVID-19, and we've seen some of the effect that also affected it in the July this year. That also we have them in the numbers. So when you look at the share of the interest payments, the chart on the right, versus the primary deficit, which is mostly in non-interest, there's a increase in the interest that government pays in its debt. So from the early pre-crisis years, 2007-8, and it has been steadily increasing, projected to reach 5.1 in 24-25. So when you think about, in simple terms, over the next 3 years, on average, for every 1 rand that government generates, 20 cents of it goes towards paying the interest on debt, not the redemptions. So those are the kind of things we think about when we put this together, and how can we ensure that we don't get ourselves too much into debt, but we at the expense of other essential services that Dr. Mark will be speaking about. I spoke about the revenue windfalls, and you would notice in the table here that when you look at the changes since the budget 2021, there are huge deviations from what we projected during the time of the 2021 budget. About 120.3 billion extra will be generated from the revenue using our revised estimates. This comes from the surging commodity prices that we've seen that has improved, but we note this as a very short-term kind of effect into the numbers. And look, the buoyancies, which is how the economy responds to, how the taxes respond to the economy, are lowered as terms of trade momentum will dissipate. You would see that in the current year, it's 1.73, and then it goes down to about 0.97. So as our terms of trade dissipate and the outlook of several major tax bases declines, we see the relationship between the taxes and the economy really going down in the next outlook. So the minister, since I think last year or early this year, and now again, we did speak about the support we've been providing for the COVID-19. We should call it the COVID-19 package, as well as some of the social needs. We made a provision for about 26.7 billion rand to social grants, and the SESRIA, which is responsible for the insurances of these companies that were affected during the looting, has also found expressions in our budget numbers with a 3.9 billion allocation. There's a business support of about 2.3 billion that we have there, and a couple of other initiatives funding that we have. And these in the social grants, they include the reintroduction of the temporary COVID grant, which is 350, that will go until the end of the current fiscal year 21-22. And talks are still underway as to how to treat it going forward. A large part of our spending as government, or a large part of our non-interest spending, goes towards what we call the social wage. In fact, about 60% of the government non-interest spending caters for the social wage. And social wage comprises of community development projects that you'd see government doing. And it comprises of social security funds. And examples of social security funds include the road accidents funds, unemployment insurance fund, and compensation funds. So it also has elements of free higher education, the employment programs that government runs, the education that we see in our communities, as well as the social protection, including the grants. So, the largest takers here, we're looking at basic education, as well as health and social protection, that they form a significant part of our social wage spending, whereas the other programs spending that government engages in, other than the interest, is about 40.5%. This is inclusive of the salaries government pays, which is called the compensation of employees. Look, let me not go further from here. Let me just hand over to Dr. Mark to really take us through some of the numbers and some of the considerations, including the sectors that are presented in the MTBPS. Dr. Mark, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues, and I hope you can hear me. All right, so I want to start off by taking you through some of the considerations around some of the spending items in the MTBPS. And the first one, which is in a way, I think, slightly frustrating, perhaps to us, as well as I think to analysts outside and to civil society, is that in this particular MTBPS, spending decisions are still quite far from being finalized. Normally, at the time that the Treasury goes into the medium-term budget policy statement, it's fairly clear what the next year's budget will look like, which makes it fairly easy to lay out in the MTBPS the spending priorities and some of the priority discussions. But in this case, perhaps the decisions are about a month or 6 weeks behind. And so that number of the issues were not put perhaps as clearly into the MTBPS as they would normally have been. And a lot of these discussions will still take place in the coming 2 months. So I just wanted to make that point, and that's partly why some of you will have not seen some of the discussions that perhaps you were looking for in the MTBPS. What I want to also emphasize in the second part of the presentation are some of the dilemmas that I think we face. So we very much, looking forward to your inputs and are hearing your inputs and are following your inputs on social media and so on and so forth. But I think we also want to point out some of the, in a sense, dilemmas and difficulties that underpin some of these decisions. One of which is that, we've just emerged from the greatest, what's sometimes called the greatest lockdown, perhaps the biggest economic recession in a century. And it had major effects on GDP for the country. Revenue declined very substantially, had major debt implications, not just for South Africa, but for many other countries. And after significant budgetary increases in budget 2020, Budget 21 contained quite significant consolidation. And we see the effects of that coming through going into this budget process. And these are quite, as you'll see in subsequent slides, quite a big area that needs consideration. The good news, as Vusi pointed out, is the economy and revenue are now starting to come back. They're not back completely yet. They're still below projections. They don't compensate yet for population growth, inflation, certain other things, but they are coming back. So that there's some good news in the story. But as you also pointed out, interest payments have grown by over 100 billion per annum and are now more than 20% of tax revenue, which is crowding out spending decisions. And some of the difficult dilemmas that we are facing are that at this point, the recommendations of what are called the function groups in the budget process, which are like the health and social development and economic services and protection services. So the recommendations that have arisen through our meetings that we've had with the departments and with the sectors currently significantly exceed the fiscal framework that has been tabled. So a big part of the discussion over the next 2 months is going to be, now how do we try to reconcile these? And there are many important and large budget pressures, and trying to reconcile those and make those decisions between them and their prioritization is quite a difficult task. Another, both South African but also global dilemma at present is the choices around continuing COVID-19 relief and stimulus interventions, as opposed to restoring fiscal balances, which in many countries have been, quite eroded through 2 years of quite strong spending growth to address the epidemic. Something else that's also interesting is the rebasing of GDP, which improves some of our fiscal ratios. So, for example, our tax to GDP ratio is now lower than it previously was, and so that does that potentially weigh into decisions about the potential at some point in the future to raise taxation, for example. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so for time reasons, I won't go too much into this, but the gap between the blue line at the bottom, which is tax revenue, and expenditure, which is the top line in red, is about just under 400 billion. So it's around 380 billion. So we're going into next year's budget spending 380 billion more than we have in revenue. And as we continue to add more and more, this gap becomes more. And that's obviously a kind of a big dilemma for the policymakers. The dotted line is non-interest expenditure. And a big question, I think, in discussion, and will no doubt be on the minds of civil society groups that are on the call today, is how rapidly should this, what's called the primary deficit, which is the gap between the blue tax line and the non-interest spending line, how rapidly should these come together? All right, I'm just going to move on because of time considerations. So this slide shows the 22-23 budget over 3 timeframes, as it was laid out in Budget Review 2020, Budget Review 2021, and this medium-term budget policy statement that's just been laid out. And I show this partly to show the very difficult situation that we are facing. So budget 21, because of these big drops in GDP, tax revenue declined for this year by 127 billion. And policymakers responded then by reducing budgets and non-interest expenditure by 87 billion. And there was a further reduction actually of 34.9 billion in provisional allocations. So these are very, very large spending or budget reductions, which are, I think, of a great, worry to all of us in a way, from a spending side and from a service side. Now, this MTBPS so far indicates that 32 billion of this will come back. So that's been indicated to date. But we all need to be aware, and this is part of the dilemmas we face, that these spending reductions that are in the baseline from budget 21 are still quite stark. They're large and they are difficult. At the same time, interest payments now exceed 303 billion and are the second largest item in the budget. All right, next slide, please. Now, this is another example of how significant these reductions in budget 21 were, linked to the great lockdown and the revenue declines that came with it. So this is the provincial equitable share, and you can see that this declined by 83 billion for the 22-23 year. And you can see, if you look at the reductions in the provinces, I mean, these are large reductions by any standard. And these are the provincial, this is the key funding stream, which is funding services like health and education. So far, the MTBPS is showing about 14.7 billion coming back, but still big reductions in the provincial equitable share, which is it's a big dilemma, it's a worry, and it's something that we have to keep looking at as we finalize budget 22. And we have to think about this also with respect to other policy priorities and new policy priorities, because we have to recognize the difficulties that come with this baseline. All right, next slide, please.
Mark, you'll have to wrap up soon. How long do you still need to go, Mark? It's Russell here.
Is another 5 minutes possible?
Yes. And then, okay, all right, cool. I'll continue.
All right. So, okay, let me just point out here, in case colleagues didn't pick it up, this table 4.6 from the budget review shows and this unallocated reserve of 15 billion, 28 billion, and 29 billion. So these are the amounts that need to be allocated out to departments in the next month or so. And then there's also these provisional allocations of 5 billion, 29 billion, and 33 billion, quite a lot of which potentially might go to ESCOM, given that some of these provisional allocations are coming through from previous years. So all right, so let me move on because of time considerations. If you go to the next slide, please. This slide shows the division of revenue. It's expressed as a percentage of total expenditure. And what you can see here, which is quite worrying, is this is the growth of interest spending. So interest as a share of the budget has grown from 10.3% in 2015-16 to 17.9% in the outer year here. That's of spending, and it exceeds 20% of revenue. And what you see here is that the provincial equitable share, for example, then drops as a share of expenditure because it's being crowded out by this interest payment. It also drops slightly as a share of GDP. Although there are unallocated amounts here, contingency reserve amounts here, and some other amounts, which will still be allocated out over the coming months. Okay, next slide, please. All right, for reasons of time, I won't deal with the slide. It looks at these come directly out of the MTBPS in terms of the spending ceiling and some distribution of budgets across sectors. All right, next slide. All right, so these are some of the health pressures that have been discussed in the health function groups with the MTech committee and with the medium term, with the Ministers' Committee on the budget. And they include for next year pressures pertaining to COVID vaccines, the introduction of vaccines for teenagers, potential boosters, potential price increases on vaccines, what would the costs be of future waves of COVID? For example, we allocated 8 billion in 21-22. There's shortfalls for medical interns and community service doctors. There are the effects of the budget reductions from budget 21. There's some shortfalls in goods and services. There's the questions whether we can retain additional health staff who were employed for COVID from 2021, and what happens with the wage freeze. So these are all under discussion. They're not currently in the numbers. They're issues that have to be finalized before the main budget. Next slide. Under social development, given the reductions that happened in budget 2021, there are shortfalls in the basic budgets for social grants, which increased below inflation for years 2 and 3. Social development is very keen to start this new orphan grant for double orphans called the Extended Child Support Grant. There are the SRD 350 grant issues which are under discussion. There are pressures from the reduction in budget 21 on welfare services and NGOs. Next slide, please. Under education, the reductions in budget 21 put pressure on provincial education departments, including teacher numbers and class sizes. And there are some quite significant decisions around NSFAS and higher student funding, which have got cost implications potentially going through to the next budget, which could be quite large. Then, of course, the ECD function is shifting from social development to education on the 1st of April. So there's quite a lot of things pertaining to that. Next slide, please. Next slide, we'll see if you're changing. Oh, sorry, there you are, okay. Then there's quite a lot of work being done around the presidential jobs program. There's about 500,000 job opportunities there. Is it possible to expand it further? There's the questions about what the wage agreement will hold, both for 22, 23. There's shortfalls in free basic services. There's ESCOM issues. And there's the effects of these 21 budget reductions on sectors like the police. Okay, next slide, please. And the presidential employment program, the question, I'm having to speak quite quickly because of time pressure, around the existing EPWP and CWP programs, the new streams of potential job creation that the presidential employment program is opening up. The budget is likely to support these for at least another 2 more years, the new budget. But how do we strengthen active labor market programs and make them more coherent? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, for time pressures, I'm going to actually not talk through some of the details about what's in the adjustment budget for health. Next slide. And some of the changes to the conditional grants, the health conditional grants that are laid out in the MTBPS. There's some changes in the HIV and related grants and in the direct and indirect NHI grants. For time reasons, I won't go through these more now, but they may come in questions. Next slide, please. Okay, this is also to do with reprioritizations around interns and others. Next slide, please. And I won't, some of these discussions around the health function group, I also won't take further now. Next slide, please. Okay, so just in conclusion, the first couple of points here, which Vusi talked about the things that the Minister of Finance talked around, trying to get the economy back on track, trying to control debt, the fact that the decisions on unallocated funds need to be finalized over the next month or two. I've tried to highlight some of the difficult dilemmas and decisions that have to be taken in the period ahead. The civil society views are really important. We appreciate the engagement and the continuing engagement on these issues. I think for time reasons, let me stop there, Russell, and sorry if we've run over our time.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. Apologies from my side and the SPII side in terms of time limitations. Unfortunately, with online work, it's a bit hard to always organize and compress time. But I think we got the gist of your presentation and Vusi's presentation. I think the key takeaway is this idea that you are confronted with a number of difficult and formidable decisions. It will have to lead to trade-offs. The extent or the nature of those trade-offs will be quite important in terms of how this will be viewed by society, but also, as you pointed out, and as Vusi pointed out, the overall impact on society. So thank you for that. What we will do now is we will now transition to a new moderator. I will quickly introduce him, and he will then handle the session that deals with a response to what the National Treasury has presented. Our next moderator is Dr. Ngobile Zulu. He holds a PhD in Development Studies from Wits University, and he's the research manager at SPII since January 2021. He has broad research interests that revolve around socioeconomic justice, gender, and human rights. His experience extends to working with youth in tertiary institutions, Wits and University of Joburg in particular, lecturing, training, and facilitating. In community advocacy, Dr. Zulu has worked on the economic empowerment of rural youth living with disability. His research work has produced reports on social cohesion, transformation, agrarian reform, and the interface it brings to rural communities, gender issues, and development. He was the lead researcher on a social justice project that investigated the dynamics of reconciliation, healing, and social cohesion as mechanisms that support restorative justice for victims of genocide and state repression. He's currently overseeing the research projects undertaken at SPII, implementing the monitoring and evaluation learning system for the organization, and supporting its executive director in projects and program review planning. Dr. Zulu, I hand over to you, and I know that we are in good hands. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Russell. I'm just smiling to myself. As always, Russell, we are in good hands. When having taken over from you, what else can I do? I just want to thank Mark Blecher, Dr. Mark Blecher, and Vusi Maupa from National Treasury for that somber presentation. I think I'm not going to go into that because there are people that are going to react to that. But just in brief, just to let our audience know, we are live streaming this session via Facebook, via this Twitter. So there, I'm going to give out the angles that we have. My apologies. I can't share my screen right now, so my apologies for that. So on Facebook, please look at Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. We're on Facebook. Look at the SPII website. We're also on YouTube, on Twitter, but also UNICEF also is available. So please look at UNICEF on Facebook, UNICEF on Twitter, and also UNICEF is also on Instagram. So these platforms, please use them to send your chats, your comments. We'll be looking at that on the chats and the comments. There will be a section where we'll ask the speakers to respond to any comments and chats that you might have. And also, please don't forget the hashtag MTBPS 2021. Let's make it trend. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Daniel McLaren. Daniel McLaren is a budget analyst at Section 27, a public interest law and advocacy organization focusing on the rights to healthcare and education, and is a part of the steering committee member of the Budget Justice Coalition. McLaren thus works at the intersections of public finance and socio-economic rights. He is also the co-founder of Inequality Coalition for Open Budgets, which aims to improve budget transparency and public participation in the budget process. Daniel, you can see his presentation. His presentation is going to start. So Daniel, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers for organizing this very timely event. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for the introduction. So I hope you can all see my screen. Yeah, I'm going to be providing a viewpoint from the Budget Justice Coalition. Fortunately, National Treasury's presentation has given us a lot of the kind of black and white numbers of the budget to dwell on and looked at some of the trends there. So I'm rather going to try and use the time that I have available to kind of look at the overarching story from the perspective of civil society organizations in the Budget Justice Coalition, looking both at the the kind of numbers in the budget, but also some of the rhetoric around the budget, particularly as we have a new finance minister providing the MTBPS mini budget speech. So in doing so, I'm going to provide less numbers so I don't have to spend too much time on those, but also try and sort of round the percentages and the rand amounts to just try and make it as easy to understand as possible in the time available. And I just want to say that, you know, as much as the difficult situation around fiscal policy at the moment is really extremely difficult to think about and process, I am encouraged by Mark and Bussi's comment that we are still at the halfway point of this financial year, and as I think Mark said, there is still plenty of room for change. So we're going to be looking at some of the areas where we might want to see change as the Budget Justice Coalition. So just I'm going to first just look at this kind of question that was put by the minister around who is the budget for, and is this a pro-poor budget? And then go on to look at fiscal policy, then look at some of the key spending revisions in the current financial year, which is 2021-22. Then look at the changes to or the continuation of plans for spending policy over the 2022 medium-term expenditure framework. I'm then going to just grapple briefly with this question of whether the budget cuts, which Mark and Bussi highlighted, which are going to come into effect from next year, are constitutional, given the obligations the government is under in the Constitution to realize socioeconomic rights. And just to provide then some analysis of what was missing from MTBPS from the Budget Justice Coalition's point of view. So I think this question of whether the budget is pro-poor, it always comes up. It's always one of the first things a journalist will ask you about the budget. And it's something which the minister decided to raise directly in his first budget speech. And I think in a forum like this, it's important to remind ourselves what the definition of pro-poor is or should be, or to debate that, because it's quite fundamental to how we actually think about the budget proposals which are tabled. So I'm going to just kind of respond to the rhetoric with, I suppose, some rhetoric before I go into the details of the numbers. So the minister said, and it was repeated in the MTBPS documents, that essentially because 60% of the national budget goes to what the ruling party and usually in the budget documents as well refers to as the social wage, but which could also be understood as basic public services. Therefore, the budget is pro-poor. And you know, kind of full stop, there you go. That makes the budget pro-poor. But I think we have to recognize that that's far too simplistic and actually quite a faulty definition of what pro-poor would mean from a budgeting perspective. And we should really return the question with questions such as, well, if 60% of the budget was not spent on the social wage, which is housing, social security, basic education, local government, healthcare, really the basic services that governments all over the world provide, then what would that money be spent on? And can you imagine a country in which 60% of the budget is not spent on those services? If so, please provide a list. I don't think there's any countries which are spending the bulk of their budget on the rich. By its very nature, the budget, even if it were allocated equally among all South Africans, so we all got the exact same expenditure from government, because we're a country in which the majority of people are poor, the budget would still be pro-poor by the minister's definition. So we need to kind of move beyond, I think, this conversation that the budget, the status quo as it is pro-poor inherently because 60% is spent on the social wage. It's not an accurate description of the reality. A much more interesting and important way to look at this question would be to say, well, given that South Africa remains the most unequal country in the world, we have more than half of our population living below the upper bound poverty line, and the top 10% holding on to 90% of wealth, 60% of income. Therefore, we should actually have the most progressive budget in the world because we have the most amount of inequality to undo. And my question to the minister would be, do we have the most progressive budget? But even more importantly than that, the idea that we should be almost grateful that 60% of the budget goes towards these basic functions of government. Actually, the government is under an obligation under our democratic constitution to spend money on realizing socio-economic rights. And it's under a duty in Section 9 of the Bill of Rights to ensure that everyone has equal access to their rights, and requires progressive measures to be taken, including in the budget process, to make that the case. So it's not a choice, really. If government wasn't spending sufficiently on socioeconomic rights, it could actually be challenged using the constitutional vision of a more equal society. And in actual fact, if we look at the submissions which Budget Justice Coalition, other civil society organizations have made on the budget in recent years, they've set out quite clearly how, if you look at the cuts which have been made to different spending areas, whether it's health or education, and you combine those with changes to tax policy, including increase to VAT, for example, the budget has arguably become less pro-poor in recent years. And finally, the fiscal consolidation strategy, which I'm going to look at, which is currently premised entirely on spending cuts rather than on revenue-raising measures, is also arguably inherently anti-poor, because it is the majority of people who rely on public services who are bearing the burden of fiscal consolidation, rather those who earn sufficient incomes and have access to sufficient wealth to pay taxes at those levels. Okay, I'll skip over this slide, covered some of this. Okay, so look, as Mark and Vusi mentioned, and I think none of us are in any doubt about, we are in perhaps one of the most difficult environments for fiscal policy since the democratic transition. Not only have we had 2 years where we've had the great lockdown, most severe recession in our history, unemployment really skyrocketing, 1.5 million more people out of work compared to before the lockdown. And before that, about a decade of declining growth, of state capture, of impact, therefore, on the capacity of the state to deliver on its mandate. We find ourselves with significantly increased public debt, significantly diminished economic growth and employment and tax revenue, and therefore fiscal policy is on a knife edge and is being crafted in an extremely difficult and uncertain environment. The response to that environment from the 2021 budget, Minister Mbowene's final budget, was basically to say that the time had come now for significant fiscal consolidation measures, because debt service costs and debt to GDP had increased too rapidly. There was no more room for any cushioning in terms of spending cuts. And the 2021 budget proposed 260 billion rand of expenditure cuts. Importantly, 40 billion rand of previously proposed tax increases were abandoned. And I think this was quite an ideological choice to really pursue austerity measures through expenditure cuts rather than any kind of tax increases in the 2021 budget. And it was therefore quite clearly an austerity budget, because it was premised upon significant expenditure cuts in order to meet a primary budget surplus in the outer year of the MTF. In the 2021 MTBPS, we have essentially a continuation of the same narrative. Although we do have some more positive news, as was covered in the Treasury presentation. So we have an increase in revenue quite substantially as a result of a commodity boom of 120 billion rand in the current financial year, and then a further 70 billion next year and 60 billion the following year. And so that means that combined with better than expected economic indicators.
Hi, Daniel. Yes. You have 2 minutes, please, to wrap up. My apologies.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'll go as quickly as I can through the remaining slides. So the basic point about MTBPS is there were some better economic and debt ratio indicators, but the fiscal consolidation strategy remains the same. Overall, we had some increases, which I won't cover because they've been mentioned, to cover kind of temporary measures. But, and as a result of those, the real non-interest expenditure grows this year, but the overall fiscal policy for the following financial year, for next year, remains the same. I think it's critical to note that even though we do end up with a positive increase in spending this year, just above inflation, there are significant cuts in the budget to provinces, higher education institutions, non-profit institutions, for example, which Mark touched on. So I think the MTBPS really threw up the fact that there are many unknowns and still quite a lot of contradictions which need to be resolved as we look ahead to budget 2021. For example, the cut to non-interest expenditure is something in the region of reducing per capita expenditure from about 30,000 Rand per person to about 25,000 Rand per person. So it's really just that it can't be overemphasized just how huge the expenditure cut that's planned on all public services from next year. But this assumes that, for example, the COVID SRD grant will not be extended, and yet our problem of mass unemployment is not going to go away. It also assumes government will not have to implement further spending on the 2018 wage agreement. It presumes that in the midst of a pandemic, it's going to be viable to cut per user spending on healthcare by 10% and per learner spending on basic education by 6.5%. So I think there's a question for civil society how we respond now. And I'm going to skip over this and just come to the question of whether the budget is constitutional. The plans from 2022, from next year onwards, are constitutional. When the expenditure cuts and that were announced in February of this year about organizations, labor movements, grassroots organizations, and civil society organizations made a petition to Parliament calling on them to reject the budget for being unconstitutional. And some of the reasons given for this were that if you look at what's required in the Constitution and in human rights law, the expenditure cuts will have negative distributional impacts in an already unequal society. Alternatives to budget cuts are not adequately considered, and there was no indication in February when—
Daniel, you have a minute. It's just wrap up, please. The last point. Okay.
And I think on this point, the MTBPS arguably makes the claim stronger, because even though we do have a rising pool of resources available, they haven't been allocated to stop expenditure cuts from next year. So I can leave on the screen, because I'm sorry if I've gone over the 15 minutes. I'll leave on the screen some of the kind of recommendations which BJC has talked about, but I think just one which I want to mention is, as kind of being paramount, is that the priority in the budget as of last year is clearly reducing debt, and this priority is really overshadowing all other priorities, including, perhaps most importantly, the priority of rebuilding state capacity. Because when we cut budgets and we don't actually redesign systems and look at operating models and efficiencies, we're just cutting budgets, we risk whittling down the state even further, so that even when we do have a little bit more money to spend, the state simply isn't capable of spending it because the capacity has been so much reduced. So I think there needs to be, in the kind of narrative and the vision which is given in the budget, more focus on how we can build state capacity to deliver on its mandate, rather than only on meeting the debt reduction targets which have been set.
On that note, Daniel, I would say thank you very much. I've given you more than the 2 minutes. I know you are going to share your presentation, right? We'll put it up.
Yes, I'll share it in the chat now.
Thank you. Thank you. Right. Thank you to Daniel McLaren for that. I'm not going to summarize his presentation. Our next session is Q&A. I haven't seen any questions on the chat yet, but I'm checking with my colleagues if is anybody posed any questions for the previous presenters. If so, please let them know. If not, then I'll give the session 10 minutes instead of the 15 minutes. Just 10 minutes for any questions from the floor, from the audience, if we do have any. From my side, I'm not seeing any. From the chat side, I'm not seeing any. Do we have any from other platforms, Facebook, YouTube, the other platforms that were streaming, colleagues? I would just like to urge our audience that the hashtag is on. Please look at that hashtag and participate. Your views, your comments, your questions are important to us. The hashtag is MTBPS 2021. Please participate, put your comments, put your questions.
Hi, Dr. Zulu. I think we'll actually just move on to the next session. Micah, please take the floor.
Thank you, Lindy K. Micah, are you ready? While Micah is getting ready, I would just like to remind the audience of the different ways they can engage with us, right? We have the YouTube, on Twitter is SPII, but also you can engage us via UNICEF. They are on Facebook, UNICEF South Africa, the Twitter, UNICEF_SA. On Instagram, it's UNICEF_SA. So please do take us on and put your comments. We are waiting for them. Micah, are you ready?
Dr. Zulu, it's Russell Wilderman here. Mike is also based in Brooklyn, Pretoria East, and they have challenges. Is it possible for you to introduce the next speaker, Nkululeko Majozi? Do you have his bio at hand?
Hi, Russell. I will do that.
Oh, please.
Hi, all. I have the pleasure to introduce my colleague, Nkululeko Majozi. He's a social security researcher at SPII, and he's responsible for driving SPII's research into social protection, particularly social security and the basic income grant. I'm sure you've seen him at our webinars presenting his various papers. His focus is on advancing knowledge and progressive realization of social security, and also participating in research to support social justice advocacy and campaigning initiatives globally and locally. Prior to joining SPII, Nkululeko worked as a doctoral researcher in the Office of the Executive Director at the African Institute in South Africa. Without further ado, Nkululeko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lindy, for that lovely introduction. And good morning to colleagues and all participants joining us from various social media platforms. Before I can start, can I just confirm whether my screen is sharing? Whether the presentation is visible?
Yes.
All right, thanks
it
for
is,
that.
can you make it full screen?
Yes, all right. There. All right, so this morning I will be presenting on SPII's analysis of the Minister of Finance's recent MTBPS statement, on social security, and in particular on the future trajectory of social grant spending and SROD in 2022 for the next 3 financial years, effectively. So I'll start the presentation by painting the picture of South Africa's socio-economic condition at the moment. So what we find ourselves in is a situation whereby unemployment is at an all-time high, with a rate of 44 or almost 45%, using the expanded definition, which is virtually half the labor market. Many jobs are not decent jobs, and we also have a rising working poor. 44% of Black Africans, 41% of Black African women, and 65% of youth are unemployed. Long-term permanent unemployment is the norm, whilst a staggering 11.4 million South Africans are currently battling starvation, of which 3 million of whom are children. Almost 40% of households regularly run out of money for food, whilst people of working age, 18 to 59 years, are without any social assistance. And this is in a country where access to social security and social assistance is a constitutional right subject to available resources. Now, if we consider the importance of social security and its impact on livelihoods in South Africa, we are of the view at SPII that the expansion of social security has been the single most successful tool through which the post-apartheid government in South Africa has reduced poverty and improved average standards of living in the country. And the government has done this by increasing the access to housing and basic services, such as health and sanitation, free education, and so on. And also the de-racialization and expansion of social assistance grants to the age and for child support. Now, social security, particularly cash grants, have been more successful than any economic policy measures implemented by government in the post-apartheid era in improving average livelihoods in South Africa. The success of social security has trumped business-friendly economic policies that government has implemented, investment in employment incentives, even public works programs, etc. However, the sad situation is that government is reluctant to acknowledge the merits of its success in fighting poverty through social security measures and grants. Instead, it continues to voice concern about grants creating a dependency, which is really a myth. There's no evidence and there's no credibility to the statement that grants create dependency. And also, government often refers to job creation as if it were feasible or had the capacity to absorb the millions of people who are currently excluded from employment. And we are of the view that it comes down to fiscal framework and what resources are made available. SPII and others have shared research that shows it is a repeated refusal to consider alternative approaches by government that condemns millions of rights holders in South Africa to misery and a lack of hope. Now, to move on to South Africa's social assistance grants. With this table, I just want to draw your attention particularly to the child support grant, which currently stands at 460, and also the social relief of distress grant, which is at 350. And basically at the moment, it's a temporary grant, and at the moment is acting as the only social assistance measure available to people of working age who are without any income and are unemployed. So I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the child support grant is only 74% of the food poverty line, whilst the social relief of distress grant is only 56% of the food poverty line, which means both these grants, as important as they are not even sufficient for people to afford the basic minimum of food requirement or energy requirement that is required on a day-to-day basis in order to just survive. Now, to look at specifically the SRD grant, although it existed as an exceptional category of grant in the Social Assistance Act of 2004, it was first introduced in March 2020 for 6 months to be paid to individuals who are currently unemployed or do not have any form of income, social grant, or UIF payment. And during its first iteration, almost 10 million applications were received by SASSA, with just over 6 million approved for payment to the tune of 24 billion rands. And this shows you the need in terms of people needing this kind of assistance. The 10 million applications just illustrates that need. But tragically, women caregivers were excluded from receiving the SRD grant, which was a massive blow for rights, for the rights and well-being of women. So the SRD grant was then reintroduced this year in August, but it will run its course and end. It's set to end at the end of March 2022. And it was introduced following the socio-political unrest of July 2021, which was a very tragic occurrence that could have been avoided. And SASSA recently, I think a few days ago, released a report on specifically on the SRD grant, and state that as of 10 November 2021, a total of about 14.5 million applications have been received by SASSA, and the age group of 18 to 35, which is basically youth, make up about 61% of the total number of applications. So in terms of looking at the trajectory of the SRD grant, there's been a push from civil society and also the Department of Social Development for the extension of the SRD grant into a basic income grant. However, there's been conflicting remarks from the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, and also the new Finance Minister, Inequality, concerning the BIG. At some point in July, the President announced that the government is considering the feasibility of introducing a permanent BIG beyond the SRD grant in March 22, and that this would validate the people of South Africa and show them that the government is giving serious consideration to their lives. However, Minister Kodongwana has been contradicting the President, shooting down the BIG and arguing that we should rather use the funds to employ Black youth rather than deliver another handout. And he reiterated also in the MTBPS that the SRD grant will indeed end at the end of March 2022. And so if we look at the numbers now, in terms of the projections of spending on social security and social grants for the next 3 financial years. And I'll draw your attention to the highlighted area that's highlighted in yellow. Now, for the next 3 financial years, it's projected that government spending on social protection will decrease every year by almost 1%, and that's a nominal decrease. But if you factor in the issue of inflation, then the real spending on social protection will decrease by almost 5% every year for the next 3 years, which is quite staggering. And in terms of social grants specifically, those grants are also projected to or the spending on grants rather, is projected to decrease every year for the next 3 years by 1%. And if you factor inflation, you get a real decrease of just above 5% every year for the next 3 years, which is quite it's quite staggering and will affect South Africans who are poor and marginalized at the moment. And
you've got 4 minutes.
Oh, all right. And so these spending cuts also came a day after the United Nations International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights had just issued its response to government's report on its progress on the progressive realization of socio-economic rights. And I'll just highlight 2 issues coming from the from that report. Basically, the report states that the UNICEF finds the progress by the government insufficient in terms of preparing an index of the cost of living in South Africa. Basically, at the moment, how we measure poverty in South Africa is based on the CPI, since the national poverty lines are based on the CPI. And also, the second point made by the UN agency's response to government's report is that it finds insufficient progress in terms of providing access to social assistance for adults between 18 and 59 years of age. So, SPII, so what is the way forward? What do we need? SPII, we are of the view that we need the government to recommit itself to fulfilling its constitutional obligations, particularly in terms of Section 27(1)(c) of the Constitution, which speaks basically to every citizen's rights to socio-economic rights, in particular social security, including if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents, and so on. We also need a commitment by the government to the implementation of a basic income grant and its extension to children under the age of 18, thus making it a universal BIG. And this should be done within a broader economic stimulus package for the next 3 years, which should provide a sustained economic stimulus to the country's economy. And in accordance to our calculations, which will be coming out in a paper, I think before the end of this month, that SPII has commissioned on the BIG, and which was presented by Duma Kubule, I think in our first BIG webinar. The projected cost of implementing a BIG over the next 3 years, incrementally at the food poverty line in the first year, the lower bound poverty line in the second year, and then the upper bound poverty line in the third year would be 255 billion, 366 billion, and 553 billion respectively. And based on an economic multiplier of 1.5, the sustained stimulus to the economy would result in an average GDP growth of 4.5 over that 3-year period. And in terms of job application, it would create about 4 million jobs. And the clawback basically from VAT, income tax, and additional tax collections on GDP growth would cover the majority of the cost of implementing the BIG. And in accordance to our numbers, 65% of the gross cost of the BIG would be.
Thank you very much, Nkululeko. I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to give way gracefully to Russell Rensburg, who is in the middle of the Eastern Cape and is about to depart from connection. So thank you, Nkululeko. And just to all participants, I know that we've been squeezing you out in terms of question and answers, but we will be having a joint session of question and answers just after Russell Rensburg has had his presentation. He'll be presenting on health budget in the wake of COVID-19. Now, Russell is someone I've known for many years, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome him to this debate. He is the director of the Rural Health Advocacy Project that advocates for equitable access to quality healthcare services for rural communities. Before joining RHAP in 2016, Russell spent 6 years at UNAIDS, supported technical support facility for the Eastern and Southern Africa, where he managed technical assistance projects, supporting GFATM grant implementation in 16 countries. He's a partner to Ruth, and together they share responsibility for raising their 4 children. Without any further ado, Russell Rensburg, over to you. Thank you. Russell, can you confirm that you are taking over?
Right. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And I'm sorry if I'm a bit delayed in switching off my mute. And I think that's one of my pandemic legacies that I still haven't quite figured out, to not speak while on mute. If Lindy can share my presentation, I would appreciate that. Or if I can share on the side.
You can share it, or do you want me to share it?
It would be great if you can share it. Just help. So today I'm not really talking so much about what the budget says, but rather in terms of, how does the budget respond to a once-in-a-century global pandemic that actually had wider impacts than just in healthcare. We heard from Mark and others earlier today around what the broader fiscal impacts have been and some of the difficult choices that government has to make in terms of maintaining at least access to socio-economic rights while also meeting all of government's other priorities. But for me, I think what was particularly jarring about this particular MTBS, not so much that the budget was, a lot of the stuff were not unexpected, but I think what we were expecting was kind of a better response to some of the lessons that we've learned over the last 18 months. So next slide, please. So again, I think Daniel mentioned this earlier, we have a world-class constitution, and Section 27 of the Constitution guarantees everyone the right to access healthcare services, including reproductive health services. Next slide, please. Section 27 also imposes on the state a duty to take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve this progressive realization of this right. Next slide. Now, when you have an external shock, and I think in many ways COVID can be described as an external shock. Many people spoke about a coming pandemic, but we didn't know when and we didn't know how. But I think we did have some experience in the run up to it, with the crisis in West Africa around the response to Ebola. And I think researchers started looking at this thing and saying, look, to what extent can we adjust the WHO's 6-component framework to health systems, and make it a little bit more topical. And I think the resulting framework was the 3+2 framework, which looks at how the different components interact and what should happen. And I think the approach is so premised on this idea of having good governance requires strong health management information systems to tell us what we're doing, where we're doing, and where we need to place our attention. Similarly, we need to have good, consistent health funding and financing and be able to adjust those financing flows in a manner that can address emerging realities. And then the last component was obviously health workforce. Health is a very people-driven business. It's used by people and it's delivered by people. And in the South African budget, up to 60 to 70% of provincial health budgets is actually human resources for health. And I think the underlying values around that is good governance and leadership. And like I said earlier, good governance, as much as it is about avoiding and managing corruption and poor budget execution, I think principally government is making sure that we're doing the right things in the right time, in the right way, and that we have sufficient priority in the way that we think about funding of our health systems. In South Africa, that isn't the case because we often just adjust budgets to meet operational requirements and on historical spend, rather than on the need to address very real realities out there. And I think some of the reforms that we have in the pipeline at the moment can contribute to that a lot. Then there's values. And in South Africa, we value health by putting it in the Bill of Rights and really giving everybody, guaranteeing everybody the right to access healthcare services rather than just health. And I think the earlier conversation around the introduction of basic income grant is also quite topical because health is not just made in health centers. Health, just like education, is sometimes socially determined. And in a country like ours with large-scale inequality, sometimes we can't sort of aspire to that idea we have in our constitution of a better life for all without addressing the structural drivers that stop people from achieving their maximum potential. Next slide. So let's go back again and say what government budget should be informed by need. And I think priority should be given to the areas where we have the least coverage. And this is a slide from John Atikuba and Di McIntyre's diagnostic report in the run-up to the publishing of the NHI bill. And what they did was sort of just seeing what is the impact of poverty and inequality, of how should health systems better respond to poverty and inequality. And you can see across the sector, or most diseases, and I think if we had another look, the diabetes numbers could be a lot worse than what they reflected here because we have a significant undercount in the number of people living with diabetes who are currently on treatment. But across all diseases, it sees that the poor is disproportionately affected. Next slide. So let's say COVID, and COVID presented an opportunity for us to really respond in a unified way as a health system to a global crisis. But the inequities in the South African system really meant that in many ways, up until August last year, or this number's around December 2020, the burden, the balance of care or access to care was really balanced towards people who had health coverage. You can see from on this particular slide, which is drawn from the National Institute of Communicable Diseases study, surveillance report showing just how testing was made up. So on the one side, we had more than half of the tests were in the private sector. And this is not to say that only medical scheme members paid for these tests, but they could have led to significant out-of-pocket expenses for people outside of coverage, with the average PCR test costing around 750 Rand, and often a requirement when people got exposed to COVID. What's a little bit more chilling as well is that a test was also a pathway to care. So without a COVID test, you couldn't get access to a hospital bed, right? And, we heard some chilling reports. If you just look at our excess deaths, which I'll talk about a little bit later, many people may have died from COVID without ever seeing the inside of a health facility. Next slide. When we look at hospital admissions, it's also not surprising that, the blue lines, I think, were private sector admissions. So again, UCT did a study on the cost effectiveness of contracting in private sector beds. And what they did was they looked at the average cost of care when being admitted into a private facility versus the only measure that we have for public hospitals, which is, I forget the metric now. It's basically, a bed utilization rate or daily cost rate. And I think the average cost of care for COVID in the public sector was probably around between 60 to 70,000, whereas in the private sector, those costs were anything between 150 to 180,000 based on Discovery Medical Scheme reports. We didn't have universal criteria in terms of who got admitted. So I think as we move forward, one of the things that we're going to need to better understand is that how those beds were allocated. Did we really consider the impacts of poverty and inequality in how we approached it and made sure that the people with the least ability to pay were able to access the service they need during a pandemic, which on a crude basis looks like they didn't. Next slide, please. And I think this one just sort of just demonstrates a little bit better, you know, in terms of the facilities that we're reporting. And I'm doing this really more than anything else to say that this is the messages that we got out of the pandemic. And there was half an expectation that given all the things that we've heard, the various NITS-CRAMS reports that came out on expansion of hunger, you know, or amplification of hunger during the pandemic, as well as other reports that were also there around disruption to key healthcare services like access to HIV testing and TB testing. And it must be noted that 61,000 people died from TB last year. And that was the first increase in a number of years. So there's some significant impacts into the health of South Africans, as well as how the health system responded to them. Next slide, please. Right, and then more recently, you know, South Africa is the signatory to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 3 works around access to healthcare services or universal health coverage. You know, and one of the things that should inform budgets and good governance really is health metrics. Now, these are metrics that they don't capture the entire healthcare system. But if we just looked at some of these baseline indicators around reproductive and maternal child health, infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases, and then health system capacity. You know, and I think firstly, the first thing to see is that there's lots of variation within the South African system. You know, so your best, the differential between the best district performance and the worst district performance can be as high as 20 to 30%, suggesting a lot of inequality of access or capacity across South Africa's 52 districts. Added to that, across all of these indicators, we're generally performing on an aggregate level at just over 50%. And with 2030 being a mere 8 years away, you know, I think what we wanted to see was probably an acknowledgement of a need to respond to the primary healthcare needs of the broader population. And if we don't do this in a systematic and considered way, you know, this gap is just going to get bigger and bigger. This particular report came out in 2017. And I expect that if we had to run the same report now, we would probably be doing a lot worse. So the expectation is that good governance and good governance from the health sector in particular would have considered some of this in its risk forecast as it looked and thought about how we need to maybe restructure the budget. Doing more of the same doesn't necessarily address this. Next slide, please. So, but yeah, budgets don't solve problems. You know, a budget is really just a manifestation of the strategies and the budgets that the various departments have put out there, and it has some political decisions within it around what to prioritize and what not. But it doesn't change systems on its own. I think we need a much bigger consideration of what our priorities should be. You know, the current institutional arrangements need reform, as the current approach, despite its name, perpetuates inequality. And I think by institutional arrangements, I'm talking about the provincial equitable share. You know,
1 minute, Russell.
We nationally generated revenue shared amongst all the different provinces based on need. But the problem with those things, with the provincial equitable share, is that despite the very elegant calculation of what each province must get, each province has almost no direction in terms of how that money must be spent, because those conditions are those allocations are unconditional. So there's a real prioritization problem if provinces don't have a clear way. Priority must be given to improving provincial resource allocations, particularly in respect of health and education. Reducing the equitable share like that we will be doing over the next couple of years without specific guidelines on how they should consider the protection of socio-economic rights will lead to regression. I said could, because I was a little bit more ambitious. But this is not to say that no work's being done. Mark Fletcher and his colleagues at Treasury have already started working on a very good district allocation formula that considers the district health needs or health needs at a district level, as well as what a reasonable funding allocation to it should be. You know, at the moment, if they are approved, these will only be guidelines, and provinces will be up to them to decide what they need to do. The last thing is, for me, we spoke about state capability and the lack thereof, but we have no strategies on how to improve it. There's very little in the budget other than some interventions at a local government level to really think about how do we execute budgets better? How do we improve decision making, informing them? And then lastly, how do we ensure that we have the management capacity, particularly at the district level, to ensure that we do the right things at the right time in the most reasonable way? And then and maybe my last slide, if I may, Isobel, is just—
You may not actually, 30 seconds.
Right, so like I said, I think the main priorities for me, particularly when we start considering how we should be planning our health budgets, which are considerable, so we won't be able to achieve UHC without any kind of explicit prioritization to ensure that those are currently outside of the health system can get in there. And I think an important part of that is investment in health management systems and the use thereof. We have good data, and data should be driving strategies and budgets. Human resources for health, I think we also need to start being a little bit more imaginative. Contracting in rather than employment has the potential to address maldistribution of capacity at provincial, district, and level of care. That means hospital or clinic. And I think it's something that as a sector we need to think about more. And then maybe lastly, health financing, doing more with less without explicit prioritization, and improve administrative capacity just leads to further collapse. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. Over.
Thank you, Russell. And it's actually in your own interest that I'm being harsh because you have to leave. Your checkout of the room is at 12. To all participants who delivered or presenters, in other words, thank you so much. You have packed in a huge amount of information. To Daniel from the Budget Justice Coalition, I know that the timing was perhaps a little unfair in your regard, so I'm going to encourage people who have questions, particularly to proceed with questions on the fiscal framework for the Budget Justice Coalition. But generally, I'm now opening up to the floor, and people are encouraged to ask questions. We'll take I think 4 to begin with, and if you could direct who the question's for. Everybody in the really clued up WhatsApp group behind the scenes, if you could help me to see where questions are. I see Russell Wilderman has a question. Is that allowed? Russell?
I will cede my question to.
Well, maybe you could lead with your question because my very bossy nature has now silenced all questions. Please do.
Yes, just to say, wonderful presentation, I think, to all the colleagues. It's really heartwarming to see South Africans engage. Mine is a difficult question to the National Treasury. When you look at the present situation, and it's obviously difficult to predict what's going to happen in the future, how long do you think the expenditure cuts which are being proposed and which have been part of the budget setup for the last 5, 6, 7 years, what's the thinking inside National Treasury? Is an end in sight? Is this purely dependent on us growing the economy a bit more effectively? Is there a limit to how much you can actually cut? Because there are concerns that you may actually cut the state down to complete incapacity. So I would just like to hear from an internal reflection from the National Treasury whether there are these kind of wrenching with these issues about how far you can actually take the expenditure cutting. Thanks, Isobel.
Thanks very much. Any other follow-up questions? Suleiman Henry, thank you. I see you. If you could ask yours. If you could just introduce yourself very briefly and where you're from.
Good, thank you, Isobel. Good morning, everyone. I'm Suleiman. I'm working for Sonke Gender Justice. I want to start off with a comment before jumping into my question. It seems that especially from government, the decisions are based on the basis or this assumption that firstly, giving more power to those with power or spending resources on those with resources will have a trickle-down effect that will empower others, and then secondly, that once the jobs are created, people will be able to take up those jobs. So I wanted to ask in regard to that, so the budget policy statement had a significant impact on resurgence of the economy and creating jobs. But I wanted to ask whether any research has been done with the de-escalating of social security and uptake of jobs, when these two will actually converge or meet for people who are most vulnerable to be able to take up those jobs, so that we kind of get to find the space where we say this is the most vulnerable that would need social security for a certain period of time. I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There is another question from Twitter to Treasury, and that is, I think, very similar in content, and maybe Mark of Wissa, you can respond to them collectively, which is, did the MTBPS 2021 cater for the most vulnerable? What are the gaps? And what should Treasury and the Minister consider doing to lighten the burden on the poor? I think, unless I am corrected by my people, that we at this stage should hand over to National Treasury and ask them to do a brief response to Russell's difficult question, and to Suleiman, and to the Twitter question that I've just read out. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Perhaps I could start, and Vusi can see if he wants to add. Although I'm not sure that, I mean, some of them might be more comments than questions, but so what is the duration of the expenditure consolidation? So I think firstly, the budget review is actually fairly clear on this, and it's what it says is that the consolidation ends in 24-25, and you see it in that basically CPI is added to all the votes in 24-25. So the wage increases come back to normal. If you see it in the personnel, you see it throughout. So the message in the MTBPS is the consolidation ends in 24-25. That's the more direct answer. Within the Treasury itself, there are, in a sense, there's always quite lively debate even within the Treasury. And I think, and of course, outside the Treasury, and even in the parliamentary committees. And, one of the questions has continued to be, look, there needs to be a deficit reduction strategy. There needs to be a narrowing of the primary balance, the primary deficit, but just how steep is that slope? So that's an issue that's always a question of debate. And, you see the numbers here being different to the numbers in past February. And, these things kind of change budget to budget as also the economic circumstances change. And then also there's the question that I think has also come up a lot in the discussion today is, what is the balance between the different parts of the fiscal framework? So between revenue and expenditure. And, revenue is not normally talked about in the medium-term budget policy statement. So we'll need to also look to the February budget to see, what's to be said about revenue. But, I think the worry for many of us is the big consolidation that was signaled in the 21 budget, which phased in effectively over 3 years. So, going into 22, the 22 year, and I dealt with this quite a bit in my presentation, there are a lot of pressures coming through from that budget decision, which was quite a long time ago, but they come through now, they come through in April. And, so that we've got to keep our eye focused on that, because there are a lot of tricky issues in that and potentially problematic issues in that. Which is not to say that there doesn't need to be more greater efficiency. There are a lot of spending reviews going on, but nevertheless, there are a lot of difficulties in managing through periods of fiscal constraint. The second question about the convergence of the jobs and the social security agenda is obviously a very difficult question. Our minister spoke about it to some extent in his speech. You know, the balance between this, for example, the jobs interventions like the presidential employment program and the social security interventions. I mean, even at baseline, South Africa's social assistance is quite a lot bigger than many other countries, but you know, how much bigger can it go? And I tried to dwell in my presentation about the choices that get made, you know, so if there is additional money, and I also showed some of the additional money that is already identified in this framework, you know, where should that be allocated to? And there are decisions that have to be made around that within the next 6 weeks to 2 months, because allocation letters have to be sent out and so on. And then so perhaps that partly talks about the question, to what extent does the MTBPS contribute to the most vulnerable? So to some extent, you know, the MTBPS only goes part of the way because it effectively lays out a fiscal framework, but it doesn't really lay out the spending decisions. And that's partly because most of them haven't yet been taken at this point in the MTBPS. So, you know, there's that envelope of additional funds, which now has to be decided, where do those additional funds go to, and which is the most highest priority area. I think there'll be comment positively and negatively around the fiscal framework itself. I think the minister laid out quite strongly, you know, what he felt the key parts of the agenda are that need to be stressed now. Vusi's emphasized a lot of that in his presentation, but a lot of the spending decisions need to be finalized in the coming weeks. Vusi, do you want to add on any of those three questions?
I think just within a minute, please.
Hi, Mark. I think Vusi actually stepped out. Yes.
Okay, back to chair then.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think there are questions that are on the top of everybody's minds, including the one that's just been raised about what does happen after March. And from what I hear from Mark, from the Treasury, now is the time for engagement. And I think the aspect of the fiscal framework is something which we would really like to have quite a thorough engagement with in coming days or weeks. But right now, and thank you to Mark for answering those questions, I'm afraid we are going to have to move on to the next session. And as such, it gives me absolute pleasure to welcome Omolara Asuni, who is a registered, from the Human Rights Commission. She is a registered barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Nigeria. And I have to say, as one lawyer to another, welcome. She holds a master's in international law from the University of Johannesburg and is currently studying for a master's in public policy at the University of Witwatersrand. She is a research advisor to the South African Human Rights Commissioner, who's charged with promoting and protecting children and migrants' rights in South Africa. Omolara is a human rights lawyer with a demonstrable knowledge of international and regional instruments on human rights. She has vast experience working on issues relating to fundamental human rights, the role rights play in democracy, and the development of society. Omolara recognizes that to ensure that everyone, irrespective of gender, disability, nationality, age, and sexual orientation, enjoys their inalienable rights to business, government, and citizens have a huge role to play. Without further ado, I hand over to you, Lara.
Thank you so much, Isabella, for the introduction. I'm not sure if I'm very audible. Can you just confirm if I am? Hello?
Hi, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you so much. I would just like to remind everyone again that we are streaming live on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. Please follow UNICEF_SA and then SPII. And then, of course, our hashtag again is MTBPS 2021. And without further ado, I'd also like to introduce the next speaker who will be speaking about budgeting and the rights of the child. I'll be introducing Russell Webman, who heads up the social policy at UNICEF South Africa. He has more than 20 years of active experience in development field, and his main interest focuses on public finance and quantitative education studies. Prior to joining UNICEF South Africa, he worked as the head of the Economic Governance Program at IBESA and did extensive cross-country work in East, Southern, and West Africa on applied budget work, small-scale farming and governance, and the right to basic education. Russell, Wilburn, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Lara. What I'll do is I'll avoid the presentation and I'll give you an oral input. I just need to set my time so that I don't go beyond 15 minutes. So the concept and practice of children's socioeconomic rights contained in the Constitution is too wide and complex to afford an easy summary of how the medium-term budget policy statement either promotes or hinders these rights. Also because the MTBPS 2021 cannot be assessed independently of what happened, say, over the last decade, established gains for children during the last decade may now be under threat due to fiscal austerity. It's unavoidable that any assessment will be partial, but this should not deter us from attempting to make well-grounded assessments of certain socioeconomic rights and how budget frameworks either encourage or hinder their realization. Just a quick word about the MTBPS. It's not a budget, it's not a mini budget, because there's no appropriation activity associated with this particular document. It's a transparency and accountability tool, and part of the reason why South Africa is routinely ranked as one of the most open and transparent budget countries in the world. While it presents a forward-looking framework, we are only in November 2021, and a lot may change before Budget 2022 is formalized and presented to Parliament. Concerning the second part of my talk, socioeconomic rights, let me attempt to summarize what legal scholars have deduced about socioeconomic rights litigation in South Africa over the last 20 years. One, and this is kind of startling, no one, including children, is entitled to claim a socioeconomic right upon demand. Two, the Constitutional Court has refused to ascribe a minimum core to any of the socioeconomic rights, and we do not have any quantitative benchmarks for establishing how far a right has been obtained or not. What we have as potential litigants is a requirement that the government must choose reasonable means to facilitate the realization of socioeconomic rights. And of course, the government understandably has the widest possible discretion over what reasonable means actually means. And of course, the burden of proof is on you and I, where the government has acted reasonably in realizing or fulfilling our socioeconomic rights. And as you can imagine, that is an onerous process. One of the sort of fruits of the constitutional litigation over the last 20 years is that the court has delivered what one can call deliberative action, deliberative conversations, duty of care. These are mechanisms that should deter anyone from interfering with your rights, from interfering with your socioeconomic rights. And there are a couple of cases that actually, in the developing jurisprudence that actually points to this. As an aside, Sandra Liebenberg, a legal scholar, offers a very interesting perspective on the notion of progressive realization. You know, this idea that most of the rights are subject to availability of resources and needs to be realized over time progressively. For her, this particular clause in the Constitution enjoins the state to improve the nature and quality of services to which people have access to over time. If we accept an interpretation of progressive realization, then one can conceptually link that perspective to that of the Public Finance Management Act, especially those clauses that enjoin accounting officers and entities to the effective, efficient, economical, and transparent use of state resources. And of course, this lands us back in Parliament and being attentive to how departments actually spend scarce state resources to realize children and adults' socioeconomic rights. This task is department and sector specific. It's unglorified work, but it's necessary work. So given all of this, what can we say about the MTBPS and socioeconomic rights? One way into this assessment is to examine developments over the last decade regarding children's programs and services. And this comes from research that we've just conducted. Hopefully, we will be able to release this by the 30th of November. We've looked across the entire decade to see what are some of the things, the good things that happened. And so over the last decade, the country celebrated the following budgetary successes. The participation rate in ECD services for children 0 to 4 has doubled from roughly 17% in 2010 to around 35% in 2019. And access was improved for both poor and rich children. And of course, the gains were made for public ECD in as much as it was made for private ECD. Public clinics were utilized mostly by poor children, and we've estimated an average participation rate of about 77%, which is quite high. Participation rates in basic education are near universal and have remained so for a long time. Spending on early childhood development, primary health care, school infrastructure, the child support grant, care dependency grant grew impressively in real terms over the last decade. And one can say the same for the expansion of the child support grant. It must be said that while the average gains for school infrastructure was impressive, it was delivered more erratically than, say, for example, ECD or the child support grant. If you use basic pro-poor analysis and you use what we call concentration indices, in other words, the extent to which services are skewed towards your poorer segments of the population, then public clinics and public ordinary schools consistently generate negative concentration indices, which is an indication of the success of the targeting policies in those areas. And I'd like to encourage us to think of these developments over the last decades as endowments that were made and should not be left out in any assessment of whether this particular government is succeeding in realizing children's economic rights. So while the budgetary successes should be celebrated, over the last decade, there were also a couple of concerns, very serious concerns. Over the last decade, spending on basic education per child has stagnated and appears in a permanent holding pattern. Both the quality of ECD and basic education remain massively unresolved, and no clear progress is visible, in particular, on the side of basic education. No progress was made on what public finance specialists call spending on the intensive margins of social grants. In other words, where you link the allocation of the grant to an external benchmark, such as the food poverty line. Those concerns have not yet been heeded. And of course, the neglect of social infrastructure, in particularly provincial health departments. And then towards the middle of the last decade, government implemented a program of fiscal consolidation, which meant severe cuts on programs and services for children and adults. Any assessment of how the framework thinking in the MTBPS contributes to the realization or not of children's socioeconomic rights must reckon, therefore, that different child services are at various stages either of budgetary affirmation or budgetary decline due to the recent context. And this makes a definitive assessment doubly complicated. Furthermore, the convergence in per capita spending levels in basic education among provinces may in fact be regarded as a sign of progress, given the vastly unequal starting points in 1994. But the near stalling of inflation-adjusted allocations during the last decade is cause for concern. The MTBPS 2021 continues its iron grip on basic education spending. And if we all accept that quality basic education is not yet a reality for most of our children, then the medium-term budget policy forecast could be said to be staunching the realization of this important and fundamental socioeconomic right. But the consistent expansion of ECD spending, albeit off a very low base, and the average increase in school infrastructure spending over the last decade can be regarded as counterbalancing forces. And there's nothing in the latest medium-term budget policy statement to suggest that these issues will be deprioritized. Furthermore, falling child hunger rates during the period 2002 to 2017, as documented by NITS researchers, suggest that government was attentive to child nutrition. But the same researchers fear that COVID-19 has disrupted and therefore will reverse these significant gains. The general decline in social assistance for children does not help to re-establish a healthy base for children's nutrition. But the MTBPS, as we all know, is a framework document, forward-looking document, and it's not a budget, is not detailed enough to discern child nutrition allocations in micro detail, something that we will work with Mark and his team. The MTBPS has put paid to the idea of increases on the intensive margins of child social grants. But Budget 22 could conceivably still bring surprises on this front. The reduction in social development spending proposed in the MTBPS means also fewer resources for the government's prevention and early intervention programs, and thus children's rights to social services, narrowly interpreted here social welfare services, might be jeopardized. This bleak news might also then be extended to child protection, and we know how important child protection is in this country. While poor children's high participation rate in primary healthcare is commendable and appears to be sustained over a decade, we've done analysis, 2010 income expenditure survey, 2015 living condition survey, 2019 GHS, issues will now shift to the overall quality of care that public clinics provide. The hard decisions brought about by falling real allocations in provincial health will complicate decisions. It's fair to say that in basic education, quality education is hard to conceptualize and it's hard to monetize. And after 2 decades of South African research, it's not clear what needs to be done to improve the overall quality of basic education. It is unclear, therefore, what the MTBPS or any budgetary framework should do to remedy this particular position. While the statement might be strongly contested, and I expect it will, there is some justification for the holding pattern presently that we observe in the basic education budget. For health and primary healthcare, the concept of quality healthcare is less ambiguous, it's less formidable, and a strong budgetary argument should be made to improve spending on health services. The plans put forward in the MTBPS do not help, therefore. For children's access to social security and in the context of competing demands, holding on to what we have may be regarded as a reasonable option, even though the first best, to use public finance terminology, would be to link social assistance to an external benchmark, in this case, the food poverty line. And given families' reliance on social grants to buy food, an overly pessimistic conclusion is also warranted here. On balance, while children will continue to receive a significant share of government expenditures, the disaggregated perspective as presented here suggests that extra caution should go into enforcing willy-nilly reductions in social sector budgets for children. In other words, the government should avoid what the our highest court calls retrogressive measures, and should provide more detailed explanations for the reversal in funding fortunes for child services and programs. Yes, is that Lindy?
Yes, it is. I think you were timing yourself. I think you need to be providing more.
Yes, I'm almost there. Yes. While the focus of this particular input was on the role of government in government budgets, we were reminded by the Constitutional Court that constitutional obligations and duties also extend to us as private citizens and corporates. For example, UNICEF's work to create a social compact with private actors, to assist in areas of severe underfunding, and our continued work with communities to build a caring framework is a direct response to this constitutional injunction. Let me conclude. Decades-long spending on children and children's services has created an endowment that we should all be proud of. in assessing the government's contribution to the realization of children's economic rights. This cannot and must not be ignored. Some of these investments, such as the establishment of social infrastructure, will continue to benefit children into the future and will require maintenance to retain the value of the created assets. Where the conversation should be focused on are investments that are variable in nature and yet have a decisive influence on effective service delivery, such as efficient and quality personnel, critical inputs such as textbooks and availability of medicines, system building such as quality and reliable M&E systems, public and private partnerships, the enduring influence of social partnerships, which we are witnessing here, and the innovations needed to break the performance logjams in basic education and health. But we are not starting from base zero, as evidenced by the strong public investments we saw over the last decade. And it's an important imperative for us to protect base zero, build on it, and ultimately affirm children as our true and sustained future. I thank you. Over to you, Lindy.
Thank you so much, Russell, for your input and for the presentation. I think it's a lot for us to consider. We have quite a number of questions since the last presentation, and they are actually targeted towards the National Treasury. So I'll read the questions and then I'll hand over again to the National Treasury to then respond. The first question here is, did the MTBPS cater for the most vulnerable in our society? And if they didn't, where are the gaps? What should Treasury and the Minister consider to lighten the burden on the poor? That's the first question. The second question is about what will happen beyond March 2020 when the SRD expires to safeguard the unemployed. And then the last one speaks to what's specifically to Mark, and is asking for his view on whether the fiscal consolidation will end in 2024/25, even if the primary budget surplus has not been achieved, as there seems to be a big commitment to realizing that particular fiscal target. So I think I'll hand over to Mark for response. And if you want me to repeat any of the questions, I can take them again.
Lara, just to say, the first question was asked in the previous round. So Mark is just the message.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Molara, for the questions. So on the second question, so our minister spoke to this question quite a bit in his speech, and he basically said that this is something that is being discussed in government. It is not a decision for Treasury. It's a discussion for government. So there has been already some discussion in cabinet. There'll be a meeting probably in the next week or two between the two ministers. So there's quite a lot of there's going to have to be quite a lot of work done to try to reach this decision, and also around depending on the way this decision goes on, implications linked to it, for example, financing implications or other implications. So yeah, I think that's you have to watch this space and be part of this discussion as it emerges in the coming months. And no doubt civil society organizations will be quite vocal on this area. On Daniel's question, I think the way I read the MTBPS and the way I hear it from colleagues like Edgar Sishi, who's heading the budget office, is that fiscal consolidation in this framework ends in 24-25, in the outer year of the framework. So whether the primary surplus is in fact achieved in that year, or whether there ends up being some slippage because of some other unexpected event or some other unexpected priority that comes up that has to be addressed, I'm not sure it should throw that significantly off track. I think that these years of consolidation have been very hard for many groups, many stakeholders, very hard for managers in many departments. So I think everybody would like to see the end of that period. I think there are debates around the slope of the reduction and exactly when, one should reach surplus. And I think that, that's going to vary across different countries. So I don't see it necessarily as throwing it off course, but a more definitive answer to that would have to come from our budget office. So that's how I've tried to respond to the two questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your response. I think another question that if the government adequately considers the impact of the decision to cut budgets on services and human rights. The government developing human rights impact methodologies with civil society, which are designed to minimize or avoid negative impacts on fundamental human rights from fiscal consolidation.
Thank you. Sorry, I should have responded to that. I personally am very in favor of that view. I think that's an excellent suggestion, but it is something that's more in the hands of our budget office. But I do think we should try to strive to collaborative governance and collaborative budgeting, and National Treasury, does continue to express its desire to be a transparent treasury and a participatory, to have a participatory budget process. And I think these kinds of collaborations are much healthier than fighting each other out in court. So, I personally think that the suggestion is good, but I think it needs to be taken up with our budget office around, to see their appetite on the specific suggestion.
Thank you so much. I think what I am hearing from you, and I think we all agree, is that we need to work hand in hand together, and we all have a role to play going forward. Isabella has a question, so I'll give the floor to her. Isabella.
Thank you. And I come here as a questioner rather than an organizer. I think, Mark, the question that I have for Treasury is, we have a huge emphasis on the primary surplus, primary budget surplus. And can we not look towards household surplus? Currently we're looking at maximum available resources. We're told that there is no space under the current fiscal framework, even for a universal basic income guarantee. Are there not global lessons that we can learn in terms of shifting our focus and our priorities? Because it seems that in a country where we rank so unequal in wealth and in income, and so many people are living in such real destitution, it's not relative, it's absolute poverty. How do we, as a democratic nation, change the way that we look at maximum available resources? As you say, it's not something that the courts are able or correctly skilled to decide, but how can we shift that? Because otherwise, from the work that we do, both at a qualitative and a quantitative level, it just seems that the fabric of our society is just not going to be able to cope in coming months or years. Thank you.
Thanks, Isobel. I'm not sure I can really answer that question. I think it more perhaps reflects the collaborative work that needs to happen between government and civil society in the period ahead. I think you asked many important and difficult questions, and ultimately the question is who makes the budget. And ultimately I think it is a collaborative process. It's a country that makes a government, and it has to be a balancing act between a whole range of stakeholders, and has to also succeed politically and socially. So, I don't think that the question the questions you ask can just be answered here. I think they reflect the nature of the partnership, but also the challenge, perhaps the challenges and the kind of working together or fights together that happen in the period ahead. But I think that you're asking the right questions.
Thank you so much. so much, Mark. I think I also agree with your comments in the comment section where it says that the idea of a constructive engagement and the fact that the conversation is to keep going on and being here is very important. And with that, I would like to hand over to Dr. Zube for closing remarks so we can then end the session because I don't see any other questions coming in.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you to everyone, starting with Christine, Isobel, from Dr. Mark Fletcher, the guys from National Treasury to Vusi. Mark, it's interesting how we are talking of constructive engagement and collaborative governance. I think that's good news to hear, despite that listening to your presentation in Vusi's, there was this talk of austerity budgeting, which Daniel McLaren, thank you, Daniel, did address and mention the concerns that we all have as coming from civil society. That social impact needs to be brought back, which I'm glad the minister did speak to. And Kurulegos, your presentation, especially when you engaged us on the value of the CSG and the SROD, how they are both below the food poverty line, speaks to the exact need. But particularly, I was touched, especially when you mentioned the 61% applicants who are 18 to 35-year-olds who could be in the job market, who could be and should be in the job market, as Dr. Mark Fletcher did point out to the 500,000 or so jobs that are meant to be created, which we are not seeing. So looking at all of that, I think it speaks to an engagement where we need to, like rightfully pointed out, this constructive engagement. And thank you to Russell for also his wonderful presentation. I'm not going to go through everyone's presentation and sort of summarize. What I would like to mention to our audience is that we'll put this up on the website, both SPII and UNICEF, as the presenters have all sort of shared their presentations with us. I'm sure anyone who has not shared their presentation, please share that presentation. We're going to put them up for our viewers and anybody else to access, as long as they are not embargoed. So please,
and the evaluations.
Yes, there's also the thank you Isobel for that. There's also the evaluation form which we have put up. Please engage with that. It will indicate to us what other future engagements that you might want to have, and whatever themes and sections that you would like us to speak to. And on that note, if there's anything else, Lindy K. Thank you, Lindy K, Duduzo, Tina, Nkululeko, Nikela, the SPII team, for all the hard work that you put into bringing this. But also thank you to Russell and the UNICEF team for the collaboration effort that we've done. And National Treasury, it's a pleasure to have you on a platform like this where you are engaging with us. We have always been seen as that untouchable entity, but to know that you are fully engaged and fully human, Mark and Vusi, it is encouraging. And I would say in other platforms that we have seen, there's been the room to engage with National Treasury, and we're beginning to see National Treasury listening. So we hope that collaborative and constructive engagement continues. On that note, I would want to close. And thank you to the audience for the questions and comments that you brought in. Thank you to Lara and Mike for handling that part. Is there anything that I've left out?
I think Russell Wilderman has his hand up.
Russell, please. Sorry. Thank you, Isobel. Russell, over to you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, this is basically just to express a thought. And really to take Mark, up on his word about the need for us to constructively engage. It was good news to hear that the end to fiscal consolidation is in sight. But what it means a series of difficult conversations amongst us as development partners, civil society, the government, about what that actually means. Because often what we do is we come from the outside and we try to project inside instead of actually utilizing these forums to have these useful conversations, with National Treasury. And I want to thank Mark and Vusi for the openness with which they've engaged. And they didn't come here with a defensive mindset. We didn't come here with an overly aggressive mindset. And that's exactly the kind of conversation that we need to go deeper. Perhaps even next time, we can have fewer speakers, for example, and we can allow more time for in-depth discussions and for conversations to be taken to their logical conclusion. So just from our side, a big thanks to Isobel and a team, but also a big thanks, I think, to all the presenters. It's been wonderful. We should reprise this as soon as we possibly can next year, but this is clearly a platform where we can engage and engage meaningfully. Thank you, Dr. Zulu.
Thank you, Russell. I would like to hand over to Lindy Kay. Lindy Kay, you have been a star on this one. Just can you have the last words, please? And then you can close for all of us. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We do have 6 minutes, not to be pedantic, but I just wanted to see if anyone else has any other comments to add. And if not, we will close. So I'll just give a couple of seconds to see if anyone has any concluding remarks or comments. Okay, thank you all.
I would like to know when I can expect my water back.
That's a very good question. We'd all like to know. Thank you everyone for attending. I will send the presentations in an email as well as the evaluation form. And we look forward to further engagements with you all. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Many thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good afternoon.
Same to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.